Okay, so it's good to meet with you today, Guin, to sort of try and get our heads around this topic of understanding the theory of organisations.
Yes.
And in thinking about it, I was reflecting back to being a social work student myself, and I remember coming to this, the equivalent of this subject, and thinking, why are we studying the theory of organisations?
Students often
They do,
make that comment.
they do.
Yes.
And I find them, that's right, they say that now. But this kind of this idea of looking in at organisations from the outside seemed to be, I couldn't get my head around why we would do that. And I was sort of thinking, shouldn't we be focusing all our energy on the skills of being a social worker within an organisation? However, engaging with the subject, it started to really make sense that understanding how an organisation operates as a social worker was a really valuable tool. And I see that now, having worked in the field, but also supporting students going out onto placement and then working in the field, that having that knowledge is just a really, puts them at a real advantage.
It does, I think. And it's not only having a broad understanding of how organisations work. I think it's really important to grasp some theory that students and then graduates, practitioners, can use as a tool to help them understand what goes on in organisations.
Absolutely.
We need to be able to analyse organisations if we're going to do good social work.
Yeah, that's right.
In that setting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, I think that fundamentally, theory helps us understand why things are as they are. Theory answers the why questions, as I think students will see on one of the slides. So with organisational theory, we're interested in why organisations operate the way they do, why staff work the way they do within organisations, what motivates people working in organisations. And we're also calling on theory to help us understand the relationship between an organisation and the external environment.
Absolutely.
So I would say to students coming into this subject, you need to befriend organisational theory as a tool that will help you understand organisations. And this links to the whole endeavour of social work, I think. Really at the heart of good social work is the capacity to use a theory to more deeply understand what you're observing.
Absolutely. And I think students often can get their head around that in relation to the practice skills. And maybe understanding organisations is a bit of a shift for them. But I think what you're saying is it's the same. We're making this very similar links.
Yes. So in 2 IPP, students have been drawing on theory to help them understand the experiences of individual clients. Here we're using theory to help us understand what goes on within organisations and the relationship between organisations and the wider environment.
Yeah.
And students use this when they go out on placement and they're trying to make sense of that organisation they're first placed in. As new graduates, students will be using organisation theory to help them read the organisation in their first job. As managers, we progress to become managers. Again, organisation theory is really important. If we want to achieve change in an organisation, we can draw on theory to help us do that. And even in governance roles on boards, theory is really helpful to both understand what's going on in an organisation and to change organisations.
So it really puts people on the front foot, I guess, in terms of engaging with an organisation as a social worker.
Absolutely.
If they can get their head around the theory.
It's very empowering. Will make for much more effective social work practice, I think. Absolutely.
Sure. Great. So what sorts of theories do we draw upon? What theories are useful for us in understanding organisations?
There's a theory for everything, as you discover studying at university. And in the slides, we've touched on some of those grand theories, those big social theories that seek to explain broad social structures and social processes. So those are the theories like modernism, postmodernism, feminism, critical theory, and so on. And each of those theories proposes a different understanding of why society is organised as it is. And those theories provide the backdrop, if you like, or the underpinnings of another set of theories which we might call mid-range theories. They're not theories that are quite so grand in the scale of what they're attempting to explain, but there's a group of mid-range theories that have turned their attention to organisations and to help us understand organisations.
Because those bigger theories you're talking about, we can use those to make sense of the world in many different ways. They're much bigger than thinking about organisational theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But they have informed theories that are more specifically related to organisations. And I think that's, while students need to understand a little about those bigger theories and encourage everyone to read about them in the chapter from Fiona Gardner's book, chapter 3, I think. And we've got a slide there just touching on those broad theories. I think students should put their energy into learning a bit about the mid-range theories that can help us understand organisations. And that's what we've focused on in the slides.
Absolutely. All right.
So when we're doing that, I think theory that I'm finding particularly useful is the theory built around understanding organisations through metaphors. And this is written about by Waring and Hughes in their book and is drawing on some earlier work by Chia. And again, I'd encourage students to read this really closely, and perhaps what we can do is just talk about the broad features of that theory.
That sounds good. And that's certainly a theory that in teaching this subject in the past, the students have, it has taken a while to get their head around it, but they have found it particularly useful.
Yeah. Yes. What I find useful about this theory built around metaphors is that it helps us understand the relationship between the internal organisation and the external environment, and to understand that relationship in a dynamic way. So it helps us understand how an organisation might contribute to social change or reinforce dominant social processes, and also to understand how what's going on in wider society shapes what goes on in an organisation. So we see that some organisations mirror wider social processes and other organisations try to do things differently, try to challenge those processes in the way they work internally as well as in the work they do with clients.
Sure. Okay.
So I do think it's a very valuable theory for that two-dimensional internal and external understanding it promotes.
And actually fits quite well, I think, with social work, that thinking of that mutual influence, I guess.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
The mutual influence between the internal organisation and the external environment. It's a very important relationship for us to look at.
It kind of fits in a way with systems theory, which the students will have looked at in IPP and LCG, whereby there is that mutual influence and one feeds into the other. And
yes.
As you said, a dynamic relationship.
Exactly. So what Waring and Hughes focus on is, as the sort of critical way of distinguishing two broad groups of organisations, is whether organisations are challenging dominant social structures or whether they are reinforcing those social structures. So they talk about upstream and downstream organisations. Downstream organisations go with the social flow. They go with the flow of dominant social structures, dominant social processes, both in the way they are structured internally, in the sorts of work they do, and in their relationship with the external environment, because they're mirroring those dominant social forces.
Okay.
And then the other group of organisations they talk about as upstream organisations trying to go against the flow, dominant social flow. So they're the organisations that challenge dominant social structures, dominant social processes, trying to do things differently and bring about social change. And within each of those two big groups, the upstream and the downstream organisations, they describe a number of metaphors. They identify a number of metaphors that describe different types of upstream or downstream organisations.
Okay, great. So if we have a think, I'm just trying to get my head into the students listening and thinking about what sorts of organisations might we see as downstream or upstream, and how might we apply the metaphors to understanding them.
A good question. I think perhaps if we start with a downstream organisation, so that's an organisation that is broadly speaking mirroring or reinforcing dominant social structures and processes. And I think Waring and Hughes use one metaphor, the machine metaphor, to describe one group of downstream organisations. And the machine metaphor really is describing bureaucracies, big bureaucracies. And in our field of work, Centrelink is of course one of these big machine-like bureaucracies. And that metaphor of the machine, I think, is a really useful tool to apply to Centrelink and to help us understand how Centrelink operates. And it really does operate in quite a machine-like way. So it operates in a regular way, a bit like a machine has a series of cogs that all have to interact. In Centrelink, the work's broken up into very carefully described roles. So we say there's a high division of labour, a high degree of formalisation, high degree of specialisation. So each people work to a position description, they perform a particular set of tasks, they're employed because they've got the skills required for that particular set of tasks. The work is quite proceduralised. That enables Centrelink to get through a huge volume of work, and it enables Centrelink to do that in a way which treats all clients equally and enables it to be quite efficient. You know, it really can get through a large volume of work by doing the same type of work in a routine way over and over again, through the work being governed by rules, through very clear documentation about how particular circumstances are to be treated, particular categories of client are to be treated, very clear written communication. And they're all characteristics that typify that machine-like bureaucracy. And whilst we might have a lot of reservations about Centrelink, it's not an organisation we all love, I think we've all got to acknowledge that it provides a huge amount of service to people at a critical point in their lives who are experiencing severe disadvantage and who are needing material support. And it provides the vehicle through which we can deliver that support reasonably quickly, quite equally and fairly to a very large number of people.
Absolutely. And it actually makes a lot more sense to me listening to you describe it in that way, that it kind of operates in an efficient, effective, certainly strives to, and fair manner with the volume of service that it provides, and in a way that enables, I guess, the social workers working within that machine that is Centrelink to work in more of a social work way with the clients that they engage with.
Yes.
So kind of because it's operating as a machine, it frees up the social work division of labour to do the work that needs to be done there.
Yes, to work much more flexibly.
That's right.
With particular groups of clients.
That's right,
knowing that the bulk of clients are being treated fairly, equally and quite efficiently.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
So an organisation we all love to hate at different times,
That's
and
right.
we've all had frustrating experiences with. But when we put that in the context of the volume of work it achieves, I think perhaps we can see the value in that, machine-like response
Absolutely.
to material need.
Yeah. So that's a great example of a downstream organisation.
Yeah, so then we think about some upstream organisations, and whilst Centrelink couldn't do its work in a very flexible way, upstream organisations typically are much more flexible, and through that flexibility they're seeking to challenge the status quo. They're seeking to rock the boat a bit, to challenge dominant social processes, dominant social structures, to promote social change, both through the sort of work they do, but also through the way they do that work.
Sure.
And some, upstream organisations that students might be quite familiar with would be some Indigenous organisations, and I think also some feminist organisations,
Sure.
which really are challenging some very ingrained forms of oppression in society.
Absolutely. So sort of women's refuges or women's services.
Yes.
Example.
Sexual assault services in
Yeah.
some instances, women's centres, some domestic violence services, family violence services, some women's refuges, and so on. And I think the more effective those services are, the less they replicate traditional forms of organisation, and the more they are using upstream forms of organisation, where the whole organisation and the way it operates is challenging key forms of oppression. Now, I think some years ago you worked in an Indigenous organisation.
I did, and I was thinking about that actually as you were just talking then. And it very much, so I did a social work placement in an Indigenous organisation in Darwin, and it was, everything that they did and the way they did it was challenging kind of the dominant or the historical way of operating. Right through from, all the programs they ran and all the services they offered. But what really stood out for me as a great example of what we're talking about was the way they worked to actively empower individual Indigenous workers in the community, and therefore their community, their families and communities. And the way they did that was they had a policy or a procedure whereby for every position that was held within the organisation, if the person who best fitted the criteria for that position was non-Indigenous, then they would employ that person, but they would also employ an Indigenous person from the community to sort of work alongside that person and to be mentored, supported, empowered to take on that position. So it was really challenging this dominant view that, I guess it was trying to balance back the discrimination that had occurred and the inequality that existed, and empower Indigenous people to take on these positions of leadership.
And to shift expertise from the non-Indigenous community to the Indigenous community.
And that was quite challenging for a lot of the non-Indigenous people in the community, but I think the way it happened was those that worked within this organisation were very much supportive of this as a way forward, and in a way they fitted very much within that upstream model of working.
Yes.
So it was it was a very effective way to challenge.
I think that's a very good illustration, and I think if we look at Waring and Hugh's diagram, the metaphor that fits with that sort of organisation, as with a lot of feminist organisations, are metaphors around the constructed other.
Absolutely.
So that organisation is trying to challenge, and through the work it does and the way it does that work, is challenging the way dominant society constructs Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And just as feminist organisations are challenging the patriarchal construction of women. And so those metaphors around construction of the other help us to understand at a deeper level why these organisations work the way they do, and the sorts of goals they can achieve through working that way, and show us how they challenge social norms and are contributing to social change, rather than just responding to an immediate need in the way that Centrelink is doing.
Great, that's all making a lot more sense now, and I think so that's sort of giving us an idea about how we, I guess as I said at the beginning, look at organisations from the outside in and try to make sense of them. I'm wondering what theories might be useful for us to get our heads around in terms of looking, more closely at what happens within organisations, what's going on inside.
Yeah, and often we do need to know very closely what's going on in an organisation when we're wanting to bring about change in an organisation, and we're wanting to enlist an organisation in bringing about wider social change. And so when we're wanting to do that finely grained analysis of what's going on in an organisation, I think we can call on the theory that informs social work practice approaches. And those practice approaches, things like a psychodynamic approach or a psychoanalytic approach, systems approach, a narrative approach, are all underpinned by a body of theory. And that same body of theory can help us understand what's going on inside an organisation, and we can use that to help us change what's going on in an organisation.
Sure.
Use it as a tool to analyse and then to change the internal life of an organisation. So if we think about a narrative approach and the theory that informs that, we can draw on that when we want to understand how an organisation is tied to its history. We often find history really powerful in an organisation, and it shapes not only the present, but it will also shape the way an organisation imagines its future, and the limitations sometimes to the way it can imagine its future. Narrative theory would talk about that as narrative foreclosure, when we can't quite see a different future for ourselves or for an organisation than the one that seems to follow most logically from where we are now and where we've come from in the past. So we can draw on narrative theory to help us analyse that and to think about how we can help change that. Other theories we draw on in practice can be very valuable in helping us understand the relationship between the sort of work an organisation does and the way it does that work, and the impact the work has on staff in an organisation. So I think some psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approaches are really helpful here. And if we think particularly, or for instance, about child protection work, that touches us at a very deep level. Child protection, we're working with a very vulnerable group of clients, vulnerable families. That creates anxiety in us as workers. It creates anxiety in organisations too, knowing they're working with such vulnerable people and with such a high level of emotion at times. So when we draw on some psychodynamic theory, we can see how one response to that level of anxiety that's created through that work that resonates so deeply. One response to that anxiety has been to proceduralise that work. So we make the work more routine, like in Centrelink, we try to develop very clear policies and procedures and rules, and to take judgment away from the individual, and to take a bit of emphasis away from the relationship the individual has with clients. And in that process, it was once thought that the work was made safer for staff and safer for clients and so on, and safer for organisations. But over time, when we've applied that psychodynamic theory a bit more closely, we've seen that really is only window dressing really
Right.
doesn't change those basic issues and doesn't improve the quality of work. So we can now use psychodynamic theory to understand that we've really got to engage much more directly with that anxiety rather than use the defence of denying it and proceduralising it.
Great, yeah. And so I guess that using that psychodynamic theory has been wonderful for managers, say, within child protection to make sense of what they see happening, but could also be really useful. I'm thinking about our students going out as social workers, for them to have that understanding of what they see going on around them puts them in a much safer position, that they can make sense of what's happening and have a bit of control over
Absolutely.
how it happens.
I think those sorts of theories can help us read organisational culture, understand where that culture's coming from and the functions the culture might be serving, and understand, our part in that.
That's right.
And when we understand our part in that, we're in a much stronger position and a much safer position, I think.
Yeah, great.
And then, of course, if we're wanting to understand relationships between staff members, we could perhaps look to systems theory. Again, a practice theory, but very helpful in understanding relationships within an organisation, and then between the relationships between staff within an organisation, and then those staff relationships to others outside the organisation. That's one. Great. And I guess the other level of theory that helps us understand what goes on in organisations is that body of theory that deals with motivation, staff motivation, people's motivations to work in an organisation in the first place, what draws people, particular types of people to particular types of organisation. But then once someone's in an organisation, how do we understand, how do we theorise, how do we analyse what is motivating people in the organisation? What sort of rewards do they value? What sort of rewards don't they value? What sort of management approaches will get the best work out of people and will make people feel most satisfied with their work? So we've also included in the slides some material around motivation and directed students to some reading around theories of motivation. It would be very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, right. So we've really, it's funny, me starting off by saying why study theory. We've really been able to think of it at many different levels through organisations, so that sort of from the outside looking in, from within, what's actually going on, and then, from a much more individual perspective, looking at things like motivation.
And in all of that, we're using theory as a tool to analyse what's going on. We're using theory as a tool to get beneath the surface of what we observe, to ask those questions about why is this going on and what do we need to do if we want to change it. So that's what theory gives us that we don't have if we don't draw on theory. It's really empowering.
Absolutely. And I think you said it at the beginning of this, really, what's at the heart of social work practice.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the exciting thing in this subject is that students here really are getting a chance to go out to an organisation, observe and apply theory, and that is what they will be getting good at it and using at the core of their social work practice throughout their social work lives.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.